It was a Sunday dinner, the kind that usually felt warm and familiar, but that night, the air in Clara's dining room was thick with something else entirely. The aroma of roasted lamb and the clinking of silverware couldn't mask the tension humming beneath the surface. David, my husband, sat across from me, his usual easy smile a little too fixed. His parents, Robert and Eleanor, were at either end of the table, looking unusually pleased with themselves. Clara, David's younger sister, was scrolling on her phone, oblivious to the undercurrents. My own phone buzzed in my lap. It was my mother. I excused myself, stepping into the quiet hallway, my heart already tightening. "Ilara, it's your father." My mother's voice was thin, strained. "The surgery went well, thank goodness. But the bills, we're short, honey. I hate to even ask." "Don't apologize, Mom," I said, my voice firm despite the knot in my stomach. "I'll handle it." I walked back to the table, the weight of my mother's words pressing on me. I sat down, picked up my fork, and tried to sound casual. "Hey, so my dad had a medical procedure. It went well, but there are some bills. I'm going to help them out this month." David slowly, deliberately, set his fork down. The kind of silence that precedes a storm, a stillness that makes the air crackle. "Your parents, your problem," he said, his voice flat. "Your money is yours, my money is mine." The room went quiet. Eleanor didn't look up from her plate, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, a flicker of satisfaction. Robert nodded once, a silent confirmation. Clara kept scrolling, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. No one defended me, no one even blinked. I looked at David, the man I had loved for 12 years, the man I had built a life around, and something inside me went very still, very clear, like water settling after you've stopped stirring it. Because here's what David didn't know I knew. Sitting there, so pleased with his own logic, he had just given me permission to take it all back. I had memorized every transfer, every payment, every "just this once" that had become every month for the Peterson family. Robert and Eleanor's mortgage, quietly covered since the year they claimed their investments had taken a hit. Clara's tuition for her photography course at the New York Institute of Photography, paid without her ever once saying thank you. The emergency plumbing repair at their vacation cabin in Lake Placid last winter. The family cruise to the Caribbean 2 years ago, the one I paid for and wasn't invited to, because David said it was just going to be family. Over $2,000 every single month out of my account for 7 years. Your money is yours, my money is mine. I picked my fork back up. I even smiled, the kind of smile people give when they've decided not to fight a battle in front of an audience that's already chosen sides. "Okay," I said simply. "That's fair." David visibly relaxed, satisfied that he'd won something. Eleanor finally looked up, pleased the tension had passed. Clara put her phone down just long enough to ask if there was more lamb. Nobody at that table understood what had actually just happened. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I had backed down. I hadn't backed down. I had just been handed the exact rule I'd been waiting 7 years for someone to say out loud. I finished my dinner. I laughed at Robert's joke about the neighbor's cat. I helped Eleanor clear the plates, rinsing them under warm water, while she chatted about her new garden club, completely unaware that she was chatting with a woman who had just quietly decided to stop being her bank. Driving home that night, David reached over and squeezed my hand on the console, like nothing unusual had happened, like he hadn't just drawn a line in permanent ink. "Dinner was nice," he said. "It was," I answered, watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. I meant it, actually. It had been a very informative dinner. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I already knew what I was going to do. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of arithmetic. If my money was mine, and his money was his, then for the first time in 7 years, I was finally going to follow the rules of our marriage exactly as written. David just had no idea yet that the rules applied both ways. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to David, listening to him breathe, slow and untroubled, like a man who'd said something ordinary at dinner, instead of something that had just ended an arrangement he didn't even know existed. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, went downstairs to my home office, and opened my laptop. I told myself I just wanted to look at the numbers. That was the polite version of what I was actually doing. I logged into my personal checking account, the one that had been mine since before we married, the one David had never once asked to see because he assumed, correctly, that it wasn't his business. I pulled up 7 years of statements. Then I opened a spreadsheet, because I am the kind of person who needs to see a thing in black and white before I let myself believe it. The transfers were all there, tidy and recurring, like a second mortgage I'd been paying on a house I didn't live in. $1,500 a month to Robert and Eleanor, going back to the year they sold their place in the suburbs and moved into that larger house near us, the one David swore was a temporary rental. $200 for Clara's monthly student loan payment, which I started covering after her first year of college, and never stopped because nobody ever told me to stop. Utility overages whenever Robert ran the heating like it was free. A $5,000 roof replacement 2 years ago that Eleanor described to her friends as "David really stepped up for us." The Caribbean cruise, the new silver Honda Civic Clara got last year, the Christmas David got credit for being generous about, using a card linked to an account he never funded. I did the math 3 times because I didn't trust myself the first 2. $2,000 and change every month for 7 years. Not a single dollar from David. Every transfer had my name on it, and every ounce of gratitude in that family had gone to him. I sat back in my chair and let that settle into my body the way cold water does, slow and complete. I thought about every time David had said, "Their family, Alara," whenever I hesitated, however briefly, about another request. I thought about the specific warmth in his voice when he defended his mother's spending, and the specific coldness in his voice at dinner that night when the subject was my own father. Your parents, your problem, your money is yours. I want to be honest about something because this isn't a story about a woman who suddenly discovers she's a victim and dramatically throws a glass of wine. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was calm, unnervingly calm, the way you get when a decision stops being emotional and becomes strategic. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a person who had finally been given permission to stop being taken advantage of. I went through my accounts, meticulously canceling every recurring transfer to the Peterson family. The mortgage payment, Clara's student loan, the automatic top-ups for their utilities. I even canceled the subscription to the gourmet coffee club I'd been paying for Eleanor for Christmas every year. Each click of the mouse was quiet, final. There was no drama, no shouting, just the steady, methodical work of severing financial ties. I didn't tell David. I didn't tell anyone. I simply let the silence of my actions speak for itself. I knew it wouldn't take long for them to notice. 7 years of a steady flow of money doesn't just disappear without a ripple. I imagined the confusion, the mild inconvenience, then the growing panic. They would have to explain to themselves exactly how they'd been living for 7 years, and at whose expense. I closed my eyes and let myself drift towards sleep. Unbothered, steady, patient. Whatever came next, I was finally ready for it. 30 days is a strange unit of time. It's short enough to feel like nothing when you're waiting for a vacation, and long enough to unravel an entire family's finances when the money that quietly held it together disappears without warning. By the end of that month, the consequences had stopped being phone calls and started being paperwork. Robert and Eleanor received a formal late notice from their mortgage company, the kind with red print and a deadline instead of a polite reminder. Clara's university sent a cancellation warning, giving her 10 days to pay in full or lose her enrollment entirely, which meant she also risked losing her ability to continue her studies. And a small family loan I'd been quietly covering for years, one Robert had taken out for a new fishing boat he needed for a business that never quite got off the ground, slipped into its first missed payment, triggering a call from the bank directly to him. I know all of this, not because I was checking on them, but because they made absolutely sure I knew. Text messages, voicemails, one email from Clara with the subject line, "This isn't fair, Alara," as if fairness had ever been part of the original arrangement. David called an emergency family meeting at our house, his choice, not mine. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, filing into my living room like a delegation arriving to negotiate a surrender, except they seemed to believe I was the one who owed the apology. Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her purse in her lap like armor. Robert stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way of a man rehearsing a speech he thinks will land harder if he doesn't sit down for it. Clara perched on the armchair, eyes red-rimmed, phone clutched in one hand like a life raft. Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling with something between hurt and accusation. "You knew we depended on that money, Alara. You knew, and you just turned it off like we don't matter." "No," I said, calm and even. "I was told my money was mine. I'm simply the first person in this family to actually believe it." Robert stepped in, his voice louder, more theatrical. "This isn't about some comment at dinner. This is about family loyalty. We've always treated you like one of our own." I almost laughed at that, but I didn't, because laughing would have given the moment more heat than it deserved. Instead, I looked at him steadily. "Family loyalty," I repeated. Interesting choice of words, considering my father was in the hospital last month, and nobody in this room asked how he was doing. Nobody had an answer for that either. Clara looked down at her phone. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. David, standing near the doorway, tried to slide into the role of peacemaker, the neutral mediator, trying to calm two warring factions. Except one of those factions was his own wife, and the other was people who had been living comfortably off her money for years. "Alara, come on. Can't we figure something out? Maybe not everything all at once, but—" "No," I said, simply, cutting him off before the sentence could turn into a request dressed up as compromise. I walked to the drawer in the side table and pulled out a folder I had prepared days earlier, thick with 7 years of printed bank statements, highlighted and organized by category. I set it on the coffee table and opened it slowly, letting the room absorb what they were looking at. Mortgage assistance, student loan payments, utility overages, the roof replacement, the boat loan, the family cruise. I read each line item aloud, calmly, without embellishment, letting the numbers speak for themselves. $2,000 a month for 7 years. That's just over $168,000. The room went completely silent. Eleanor's hand drifted to her chest. Robert's arms uncrossed, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked less like a man delivering a verdict, and more like a man realizing he might be standing trial. Clara finally spoke, her voice small. "I didn't know it was that much." "None of you did," I said, "because none of you ever asked. You just assumed it would always be there." David stared at the folder like it belonged to a stranger, his face pale, his jaw working silently. I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the early stages of a man realizing the story he'd told himself about his own generosity was about to collapse in front of the very people he'd told it to. I closed the folder gently and looked around the room at each of them in turn. Eleanor's stricken face, Robert's uncertain posture, Clara's quiet shame, and finally David, still standing near the doorway like a man who suddenly wasn't sure which side of the room he belonged on. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice steady, unhurried. "You should probably ask David where he told you all this money was coming from." Every head in that room turned toward my husband at once, and for the first time in 7 years, I watched the version of himself he'd built for his family start to come apart at the seams. Eleanor turned toward her son slowly, the way people move when they already suspect the answer will hurt, and are bracing themselves anyway. "David," she said carefully. "What does she mean? Ask you?" David didn't answer right away. He stood there in the doorway of our living room, his hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and I watched 12 years of practiced charm fail him for the first time in front of an audience that actually mattered. In the days and weeks that followed, the silence from the Peterson family was deafening. The frantic calls and texts stopped. David, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of bewildered apologies and panicked explanations. He tried to spin it, to say he was just managing family finances, but the evidence in that folder was too stark, too undeniable. He had let his family believe he was their generous benefactor, all while using my income to fund their lifestyle. The truth, when it finally came out, was a slow, painful unraveling. Robert and Eleanor, faced with the reality of their financial situation, had to sell their larger house and move into a much smaller apartment. Clara, after a tearful conversation with me where I explained I would not be covering her tuition, took a gap year and found a full-time job at a local cafe to save up. The facade of David's generosity crumbled, revealing the fragile foundation it had been built upon. For me, it was a strange kind of liberation. The money that had silently flowed out of my account for so long was now mine again. I used some of it to pay off my parents' medical bills completely, no questions asked. I hired a contractor to fix the leaky roof on their old farmhouse, the one my mother always said she'd get to eventually. I even set aside enough to send them both on a small trip. Nothing extravagant, just a few days at a lake house upstate, because I realized somewhere along the way that I had spent 7 years funding other people's comfort and none of my parents' joy. My father cried when I told him about the roof. Not loudly. He's not a man who cries loudly, just a quiet welling in his eyes as he sat in his recliner, waving his hand like he was embarrassed by his own gratitude. You don't have to do all this, Alara. We managed before. I know you did, I said, sitting beside him, taking his hand. But you shouldn't have to just manage. Not anymore. This isn't charity, Dad. This is love. I finally get to give it the way I always wanted to. He squeezed my hand, and neither of us needed to say anything else. David tried in his own way to make things right. He apologized more than once, and I could tell some of it was genuine, buried somewhere under the panic of nearly losing something he'd taken for granted for over a decade. But I noticed something important in those apologies. He kept circling back to the consequences: his mother's disappointment, his sister's financial scramble, the awkwardness at family gatherings. He rarely, if ever, circled back to the actual wound, the fact that he'd stood at our dinner table and dismissed my parents as a problem that wasn't his concern. I didn't rush to forgive him, and I didn't rush to punish him either. I've learned that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to go back to how things were, simply because someone finally apologized. I didn't file for divorce. Not yet. But I did something I should have done years earlier. I sat David down and laid out new terms for our marriage, the same way I had laid out numbers in that conference room. Clear, specific, nothing implied. Separate accounts stayed separate. Major financial decisions required both of us, out loud, at the same table. No secret arrangements, no unspoken assumptions about whose family mattered more. And I told him plainly that we needed marriage counseling, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to know if the man sitting across from me was capable of actually changing, or simply capable of being sorry when caught. He agreed to all of it. Whether that agreement holds is still something time will answer, not me. Meanwhile, the Peterson family adjusted the way people do when a safety net is finally removed, and they discover, often to their own surprise, that they're more capable than they thought. Robert and Eleanor downsized further, moving into a smaller apartment that fit their actual pension instead of the inflated lifestyle 7 years of my money had quietly subsidized. Clara took a second job at a local cafe 3 towns over, and the first time she called me, it wasn't to ask for anything. It was simply to tell me, almost sheepishly, that she'd made her first student loan payment entirely on her own. It felt strange, she admitted. Good strange. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. Nobody in that family calls me their emergency fund anymore. Nobody assumes, and strangely, in the space where resentment might have grown, instead something a little more honest has started to take root. Conversations that don't automatically involve money, boundaries that don't require a folder of bank statements to enforce. A few nights ago, I sat at my parents' kitchen table for dinner, the small one with the wobbly leg my father refuses to let anyone fix because he says it has character. My mother made pot roast. My father told the same story about his fishing trip that he's told 100 times, and I laughed at it like it was the first, because some things deserve that kindness. Halfway through dinner, my phone lit up on the table. David's name. Can we talk? I looked at it for a moment longer than I expected to, feeling the pull of 12 years of habit. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to my mother's pot roast, back to my father's story, back to the people who had never once made me feel like a burden or a transaction. He told me my money was mine, so I finally believed him. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people, events, or places is purely coincidental.